It is 1931 in Western Australia, approximately 80 miles north of Perth, a city that had celebrated its centenary just 2 years earlier. 3 young girls, Molly, aged 14, her half-sister Daisy, who is 8, and her cousin Gracie, who is aged 11, are traipsing through the Australian outback alone and barefoot. They have no map, just a general idea of what direction they need to be walking in. But this isn't just a normal hike that one might take on a weekend. These kids are on the run. They're being chased by the state, who are using all the resources they have available to track them down. After several days of tracking in the outback, the girls spot it. A crude wooden fence wrapped up in chicken wire. Looking left and right down the fence, it stretches as far as the horizon, almost as if it has no end at all. This is the rabbit-proof fence, their lifeline and beacon home. But what is it that they're escaping from, and why is this fence their ticket home? We will be finding out why, but before we get there, let's head over to Context Corner.
Ryan loves context.
It's important, and especially in this, because, as I said, I came into the story with no knowledge of sort of Aboriginal culture, and I was like, oh yeah, Aboriginal culture, it's all didgeridoos and boomerangs and all that sort of stuff, right? And I watched a video where some Aboriginal people was like, everyone thinks that our culture is just didgeridoos and boomerangs, and I was like, oh my god, I'm one of those people. And it's because we obviously we're on the other side of the world, we're less likely to learn this stuff as it is, but...
I have a boomerang. Well, I'll say my parents have one. My friend got it for me when he went to Australia, and I was like, this is awesome. An actual Australian boomerang.
Yeah, they're fascinating, really. They are cool tools. So let's get into sort of a little brief history of Australia and sort of first contact to really give us a sense of like the world we're about to inhabit. Now, for many Australians, January the 26th is a day of conflicted feelings. Known as Australia Day, it marks the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788 when Governor Arthur Phillip landed at Sydney Cove with a Union flag, establishing Australia's first penal colony. This is sort of known as Australia's birthday, and you'll see many an Aussie wandering around waving their flag, engaging in community events and sort of watching formal ceremonies held by the state. But for many others, Australia Day is known as Invasion Day. They see Arthur Phillip and his flag as invaders, who were the first of many hundreds of thousands of people to establish towns and cities on land that was already lived on by the continent's original inhabitants. It can be a day that represents the success of one people at the cost of another. Now, the British had recently lost the United States to those pesky rebels and needed somewhere else to relocate their convicts. I didn't know this, that America was basically a penal colony before Australia.
No, me neither. I actually got into a discussion recently with an American in a TikTok comment section about why the British never learn about sort of what happened over there in our history classes. And it was really interesting because obviously to them it's this massive thing. Like, it's the birth of their country, essentially, the modern country that we know. But to us, it's a footnote, isn't it? It's a footnote.
Yeah, it really is. Because again, and this is exactly what happened, we lost the United States as they were at that time, and we went, we'll just have Australia.
And then, like, I'm not saying this in a way of look at us how awesome we are, I'm saying it in a factual, then went on to build the biggest empire in the world after that.
I find fascinating. I had a conversation with someone about this, and they were the type of person that was glazing over the British Empire, as it were, and being like, "Oh, wasn't it brilliant? We owned this and we did that." And I'm like, "Who's we? Who's we?" Because I'm sorry, if you lived back then, I'm sorry, mate, you would not be anyone of importance. Like, chances are you'd be dead of disease or you'd have starved to death because there was no NHS, there's no benefit system, there's no like welfare system in any way, shape, or form. Like,
I get really seasick as well. You would not catch me going to any country.
Yeah, I'd love to have been on one of those ships, though, despite the fact that they were death traps. Anyway, Australia was seen as the ideal place to put a penal colony. It's somewhere on the other side of the world, somewhere that for the regular person like you and me, James, it may as well have been on another planet, and we were the type of people that were likely to be sent there. And if we were sent there, we were almost certainly never coming back to our family in the UK. So it was effectively a life sentence without actually having to kill someone.
And yet, fast forward however many years to 1939, 41, wherever, people have evacuated to Australia.
Yeah.
So if anything, that journey then became something that people not necessarily wanted to do, but it was seen as go there and you're safe, as opposed to now where it's go there and you're fucked.
We'll also find out as well that a lot of these convicts that are sent to Australia, it's not so much like you go there, you'll be in prison for the rest of your life. It's very much they want to establish a colony as well, but they also want to send away their prisoners. So
It's
a lot
free
of
labour,
people,
isn't it?
it's free labour. They go out there, they build cities, they build towns, and once their sort of sentence is over, they can effectively just go out and live there.
Yeah.
So Australia was labelled as terra nullius, which means in Latin, nobody's land. For the layman reading that, they'd be forgiven for assuming this new land really wasn't uninhabited and therefore free real estate. But that, of course, was not the case. There were indeed many a people living in Australia when the first fleet arrived. In fact, it had been home to people for around 65,000 years, and those that had prodded at Australia before making it a colony knew that fact. The reality was that they didn't really see these people as having a civilization that they really recognised, and then they therefore dismissed them as a people without one. When explorers wandered ashore, they saw a vast land without buildings, towns, or cities. There appeared to be no recognisable farmland to speak of. Conclusion: nobody will complain when we set up camp. But what the Brits had trouble recognising is that the Aboriginal people of Australia did things their own way. They may not have built towns and cities like Europeans. There were no forts, there were no castles, there were no sort of walls that marked borders that were, distinctive. They had no real disputed sort of lands or specific countries. No defined farmland with recognisable crops or cattle. They saw people who were, in their eyes, uncivilized.
It's a fascinating word, isn't it? Because it gets thrown around a lot. It's a civilized. Well, you hear it nowadays as well, especially when people talk about the Middle East, but it's an uncivilized country. Why? It's just different.
It's different, yeah.
That's the word you're looking for. That's not what I'm used to, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah. Now, I was looking into this, and we are going to get into it a little bit, but just sort of to go off the top of my head now. I was looking into sort of like, why did the British in some places sort of work with Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples? Why is it that, say, New Zealand with the Maori, they sort of established some sort of treaties in some places and they worked with them in some other areas? In Canada, they tended to work with a lot of sort of native tribes as well. Why in Australia did they not do that? And the answer really is a case of just how they viewed them. So some people were able to sort of create some sort of military force that was enough that British went, do you know what, I'm willing to have the conversation. Some were able to sort of have a civilization that the British at least could understand to a certain degree, even if it was lesser than what they thought it was. Whereas with lots of Aboriginal people, because they're quite sparsely populated and sort of all over the gaff. They didn't really look at them as being anything more than just sort of wandering people that hadn't established anything. But that, of course, is not true at all.
So it comes down to, I guess, did they respect them or not?
100% that, exactly that. You're spot on. It's a case of they didn't respect them, but they didn't recognise how they lived as being anything worth sort of looking at. So therefore, they assumed they didn't have anything.
Right. And I'm sure this leads on to many people dying.
As I was saying, the British are judging the Aboriginal people and their civilization based on their own European standards, right? And it's this way of thinking that almost justifies their racist oppression of an entire people. You can look through British history and see it play out in other regions, such as Africa, right? They judge a culture, a civilization, based on their own, and then deem it to be inferior based on that, therefore justifying, a sort of a caretaker type of rule or a straight up colony to just try and civilize a people. They're like, oh no, you need us because we will bring all these lovely things. And lots of people that are already living there are saying, well, no, we're totally fine with how life is right now.
But ultimately, the defining factor is, could these people really go to war with us? And if the answer is no, then we'll be like, oh, we'll take this then. If the answer is yes, I think a lot of the time we go, actually, these guys are civilized because they have a military power. Is that the level of criteria?
Oh, pretty much. And do you know what's really fascinating? And again, I will address this probably lots of times throughout this episode, where I've had to sort of be exposed to my own prejudices on the world as a European, looking at the world from Europe and sort of how I'm adjusted to my life in Europe, right? when people think about this idea of civilized or uncivilized and whatnot, you're playing the wrong game. So we're about to get into this a little bit more, right? But when we think of like the UK, we think of the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, the Industrial Revolution obviously came about through coal and steam and all that sort of stuff in the UK because that's what we had to offer. But in places like Switzerland or in Austria and the Alps and all that sort of places where you had sort of more hydro power because you've got more waterways that can sort of give off with your spinning wheels for the water and all that sort of stuff. Like, so they had their own industrial revolution, but they did it in a slightly different way, which meant they became experts in their own particular field. The UK became experts in its particular field, and it's not a case of, oh, one particular person was not able to sort of match up to this thing. You're not all playing the same game, and that's the point, right? They're all doing their own different thing. And also, we'll get onto this a little bit later, but like geography will have a huge impact on sort of how civilizations grow, and we'll learn that Australia is really fucking difficult to live in.
Oh, yeah, isn't like a fraction of it actually inhabited and the rest of it just uninhabitable?
European mindset, bro. It's because we can't live in those places.
Oh, yeah, fair. Okay. Oh, wow. Learning. Let's move on.
Right, let's move on. The idea that these people are uncivilized, of course, is not true, right? The Aboriginal people of Australia may not have built towns or cities. They may not have established agriculture in the same way that Europeans had. But the question is not why didn't they do the same thing? The question is really what would they have done with it? Okay, so firstly, it's important to acknowledge that there is not just one tribe wandering around that just never established a nation. If you look at a map, it's fucking insane. There were hundreds of small independent tribes with their own territories, languages, hierarchies, and laws. To assume that they would have at some point created one large nation with a unified identity is mental. You can fit quite a significant portion of Europe into Australia because it's massive. Now think how many unique languages and cultures have independently grown in Europe. It's the same with pre-colonial Australia. It would be mental to assume that they just create one country.
Yeah, it's fucking massive, isn't it? But also, like, England's not that big, and we started life as tribes as well.
Correct, right? So it's bizarre. Like, so when people think of Aboriginal people, again, learning. When people think of Aboriginal people, there's like this sense that they're all kind of the same, but of course that's not the case. There's hundreds of different tribes with their own sort of established country, with their own culture and their own ways of doing things. So, why no farms or towns, etc.? Well, many Aboriginal people were living a hunter gatherer hybrid sort of lifestyle because Australia's climate is mental. The seasons can be incredibly unpredictable and harsh. This can make agriculture incredibly difficult, and when you can depend on the seasons, you then tend to set up shop and establish towns and so on. So, this is something I learned when I was reading Goliath's Curse, right? It sort of explains how humans have evolved to create civilizations, and inevitably they always implode when they get too big, right? And that's why it's called Goliath's Curse. Goliath gets too big, and a Goliath ends up becoming too easy to knock down. Um, Humans, just in general, in terms of where they were able to establish things like agriculture, obviously we were hunter gatherers, and then at that point you're like, this actually can exert quite a lot of energy. And then obviously once we established that we could plant things, and if you just hang around for a bit, that will then create food, and then you can harvest that food. You're then more likely to establish sort of a border to protect what you are growing, and then from there you establish a small community, which then can become a town, which then can become a city, and then can become a country, and then has unified sort of an identity and sort of goes from there. But you can only do that when you can rely on the seasons. And if you can't rely on the seasons, you can't stay in one particular area because that would be pointless and you're likely to die. So you have to keep moving. And that's exactly what's going on in Australia because it's so unpredictable.
That's so interesting. Like, genuinely. It sounds so obvious when you say it, but I've never really considered it that way.
Really does. And you know what? I don't know if I mentioned this one to you, but I found this out, and apologies if it's wrong, but I looked it up and I think it to be true that Australia is one of few places that sort of didn't quite just of its own fruition invent sort of the wheel, right? But one thing I found out was that if you gave sort of Aboriginal people a wheel, they'd probably go, I don't really need this, right? Because the sort of the terrain and the climate and whatnot, it would almost make it redundant and pointless. And in fact, in Europe, unless you were living in a built up area, if you had a cart with wooden wheels, you might as well not bother fucking using it, because unless there are defined roads where you can use it, it's useless.
Yeah. That's interesting. So you only invent, what is it? Necessity is the cause of invention. That's not saying,
Necessity
but
is the mother of invention.
mother of invention. That's the one.
Yeah, yeah. It's honestly been fascinating to be like, yeah, your environment sort of creates the thing that you need. Like you sort of adapt to it. Then there's the fact that the continent of Australia has no large cattle-like fauna. So there's no cows, there's no bison, there's no horses. They never existed, right? These are animals that were domesticated and used for farm work around lots of other parts of the world. But remember, like, there's no horses in South America, so that's not a thing. But it helps for those that do have these animals. It makes farming easier. In Australia, what would you use them to help? What would you use to help farm? If you don't have these big animals, you're just going to be doing it all by hand. And at that point, like, again, it's too much labor. Don't need that. Couple that with the fact that the seasons can be very unfriendly to crops. What would you even farm? Now, to give you a sense of how crazy the climate can be, Australia has unique plants called pyrophytes, which actually use fire as a trigger to break their seeds off. And Aboriginal peoples learned this and became experts in setting off strategic forest fires to clear an area to help repopulate it with new fauna. Isn't that cool?
I didn't know that. That is, I think adaptation and evolution is fascinating as it is, but the fact that it evolved to a climate that fire is likely,
Yes. Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yeah, it sort of the heat and whatnot can actually, it triggers off the plant to go, oh right, spread out seeds, throw everything about. And the fact that Aboriginal peoples were like, oh, we understand how to sort of to manage this land in a particular way, and they could set off their own fires in a very smart way to try and clear an area. I think it's fascinating. And the British didn't know that, right? So if you was to judge sort of their version of farming and this thing, it's like, right, okay, who's the uncivilized person really? Because but this is the point, lends to your point, where it was like, just they're doing things in different ways.
Oh, that's the thing. You stick like an English bloke from that time, just say you've got to survive here in this climate. Good luck to you. He'd be dead. Very quickly be dead.
I literally have that in my next paragraph. So the point is, just because they had not developed in the same way that Europeans did, it does not lessen them as a people or a civilization. They were uniquely talented in their field, and that became evident when the Brits came ashore and died in their hundreds because they were unable to successfully farm the land or navigate the area without falling into a crocodile or having to force a local to be their guide. So, right, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sorry, most people could probably wander onto Europe and then discover a farm by accident. Do you know what I mean? You could just drop a seed in the floor and it will grow. Not here.
Yeah.
Now, what I don't want to do is begin romanticising Aboriginal society. We see this a lot with other nations who have peoples that predate their respective countries, such as the US, Canada, and many other Central and South American nations. It's very easy to fall into the legends and myths and envision a utopian society that was ripped apart by Europeans. The reality, of course, is more complicated than that. Aboriginal societies, like every other society in history, have had their own conflicts, they have their own hierarchies, customs, and hardships. Recognising the crimes of colonisation does not require pretending that pre-colonial life was perfect. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, because I just think it's really easy for us. Like, you'll see this, you'll go into like a store and it will have like Native American stuff and it'll be like, I was all about the love of the land and this, that, and the other. And it's like,
it almost trivializes it.
yes.
Being like, look at this thing that used to be here that we put a fucking stop to with violence, and now you can buy a hat. It turns it into a gimmick, essentially.
Yeah. Now, of course, from that perspective, like, I am a centrist. I like to see both sides to a story where possible, because, for me and I genuinely think that the truth invariably lies in between the two. So, We in the UK often joke about our Australian cousins regarding their origins as a penal colony, but the reality was actually quite horrific. Many were indeed prisoners who were sent to Australia as punishment. They would be prisoners first, and when they'd served their time, they'd go out into the colony to help make it a success. Sort of, here's some land, build a home and a farm, off you go and get on with it. Now, often these lands were just outside the colony boundary, which helped obviously increase that over time. The problem with that is that the new citizen of this colony may not be a seasoned farmer. They almost certainly don't know the land well enough to farm it successfully on their own. But let's just assume that they've managed to build a small cabin, they've got a wife and a kid, and maybe they've managed to get a few crops in the ground and they think that it's actually started to take, okay? They're finally getting somewhere. Now, in the distance, they see a group of Aboriginal people walking through their farm, and they're both quite shocked to see one another. For the colonist, this is his farm that he's been given. He's got a wife and a child in the house, and he doesn't understand these people in the farm. He doesn't know what they're saying. He thinks they look intimidating, and so he grabs his firearm just in case. For the Aboriginal peoples, this is their land. He's been For the Aboriginal peoples, this is their land, has been for generations. They've got oral stories explaining how this land came to be their ancestors. Now, all of a sudden, there's a white man with a hut, and he's growing crops that clearly look like they're failing, but he doesn't seem to realise that. They want to know why he's there, but then he picks up his firearm.
It's immediately hostile. I see what you mean. They're both, yeah. It's difficult to have a dialogue with each other when someone's got a gun in their hand.
Correct, right? Now, I'm clearly oversimplifying how relations between colonists and Aboriginal people went down, but you can imagine how a lack of understanding of one another can cause friction and eventual violence. And to be Eurocentric for a moment, as mentioned earlier, many of these people arriving in Australia were criminals and the poor. These are people who, in the UK at least, were unlikely to ever amount to anything. They were unlikely to ever own land, start a business, but in Australia they were given an opportunity. They could own land, they could build that forever home, and maybe start up that small business that they could pass on to their children. Unfortunately, it was at the cost of another. Either way, it was the elites who were using one oppressed people to oppress another, using the facade of social mobility. So while I'm not trying to sugarcoat colonialism, I do want to put real humans in the story.
I understand. If you are someone in the UK, you're not, I don't think, going to Australia with the intention of, I'm going to commit genocide against another people. You're going there because you've been promised a better life.
Correct, exactly. And like like I alluded to earlier, it's an elite people who are trying to sort of grow an empire, and they're gonna convince you, the bumfuck from nowhere, be like, you can be the first people that go over there and expand on this empire, and you get your own land. In fact, you know what? They probably didn't even mention the word empire to them. They just said, do you want your own land? Do you want your own home? And do you want to start that business you've always wanted to start? We'll send you off to Australia. And they've gone, this could be our opportunity.
This sounds exactly like another country currently in the world. Exactly what they're doing. We've got our land. You can come here. You don't have to immigrate here. You can just come here. Oh, look at that across the border. Go and take that. That's yours. Go and take it from that other person. They're beneath you. It's worrying how we haven't learned, isn't it?
Yeah, and it really is. And this is the thing. So when we say, worrying that we haven't learned, it's more that those that have the power and have the ability to do so will always manipulate those that don't.
Yeah, I guess. And people are easy to manipulate, so.
Yeah, and in this instance, again, I don't want to try and simplify, but it's entirely possible that in this sort of fake scenario that I sort of brought up, that guy, that colonist who picked up that rifle in front of the Aboriginal peoples, who he's unsure of what they're there for, he doesn't really understand them, doesn't know their history, can't talk to them, probably doesn't want to try and talk to them. But this is a guy who has been sold something. He's been sold a lie, or he's been sold like a story of at least, and he really wants this to work. And he's being told constantly that these people are not worth your time.
Yeah. if they could just find a way to communicate with each other, maybe they'd get on.
Well, sometimes it's a case of as well. Like, don't get me wrong. It's not that a lot of these white people, these white European, British people, are like really friendly and really nice. If you just had a conversation with them, they'll be great. Like that's not obviously always the case because these are people just randomly in your back garden, and you're like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "Well, no. If we just had a conversation, you'll let me stay in your back garden." It's like, no, it's not really how it works.
No, yeah, that's very, very well put.
Either way, the friction was real and violence ensued. The frontier wars began almost 150 years of sporadic battles between British settlers and the various Aboriginal tribes that they bulldozed out the way to create their towns and cities. Hundreds of massacres are recorded from both Aboriginal peoples and the settlers, either on their own or in response to a spate of killings. And one that I will highlight is the Mile Creek Massacre in 1838. Warning, this is quite graphic and brutal. If you want to skip it, I'd say maybe give it a minute and then I will have finished reading it. But this is the Mile Creek Massacre. In 1838, a group of men organised to slaughter a group of Aboriginal people from the Wurrayeri tribe. They were camped out at a station house, invited by a person who would go on to be involved in the massacre. These men tied the 28 men, women, and children together with rope and led them to a gully where they were then proceeded to be hacked at with swords for hours, taking their time in killing them all. They even had fun with it, making them run alongside a fence with the men holding out their swords in front of them so that they would be hacked at as they ran past them. The children were beheaded and the bodies were then mutilated. One woman was kept alive, but only so she could be sexually assaulted by the group for days on end, all while people of her tribe lay out in the open, having been burned by the murderers. Whew. Sadly, as mentioned, massacres like this were not uncommon. The acts themselves in this case are incredibly brutal. I won't say that these were all like this, but the fact that it happened here means that it could have happened elsewhere and not been recorded. We know about this one because the perpetrators were actually taken to court for their crimes and were eventually let off. Which is no surprise. One of the jurors at the trial is alleged to have said privately, I'm going to get you to read this quote.
From a member of the jury, you say?
Yes.
I look on the blacks as a set of monkeys, and the sooner they are exterminated from the face of the earth, the better. I know the men were guilty of murder, but I would never see a white man hanged for killing a black.
That's insane from a juror.
Oh, well, at no point is that a fair trial.
No, and obviously they got off, right? Because again, this is the problem. They didn't see Aboriginal people as being people at all.
That's fucked, man. That's so deeply fucked. And it worries. Again, I always whenever we do an episode, I always think about how does this fit into modern context? What can we learn from it? Do you think there are people in juries nowadays that have similar views? They're not brave enough to wear them nowadays, but they view this, they think this, and they sit there judging people, and people get off because of mindsets like this still.
Sadly, there are still people that have a similar thinking to this. And in terms of our story, in terms of being on Australia, there's quite a lot of sort of negative sort of opinions on Aboriginal people. There's a lot of stereotypes about Aboriginal people as well that are just based purely on racism, which is just not appropriate at all, and not true.
Yeah. It's just to dehumanize. It's to other people, isn't it? That's what they're trying to do.
Exactly that. And we've looked at sort of how one dehumanizes in a Unit 731 series. It's surprisingly easy.
Oh yeah, for sure. You could do it nowadays. Really, I think we people are trying to do it nowadays.
Are trying to do that, yeah. Now, thankfully, there was a retrial afterwards, and all of those on the stand were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, all except one. John Henry Fleming, the leader of the group who committed the massacre, he had fled and was never captured. He would go on to commit suicide 14 years later. His family say that it was from the guilt of what he did, but would never really know.
No, but I hope it tormented him for those 14 years.
I hope so too. Right, that's enough on the massacres. I could honestly spend an entire episode on this, as you know me, detailing the revenge killings and all that, but we really do need to move on. The frontier wars, as they were known, would eventually end around the 1930s. Killings of each other, like insane.
That's not that long ago.
Tens of thousands of Australians have been dead, killed over this period of time, but it's the Aboriginal people who really lost. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Many tribes completely wiped off the map. Now, if there's one thing I feel I can confidently say that came from all this violence was a sense of identity. White Brits now beginning to identify as Australian. They felt as though they had bled for this new country. They had learned how to live on the land. They understood their bushcraft now. And with that identity came a sense of who wasn't Australian. And can you guess who wasn't Australian, James?
I'm going to guess the Aboriginal people.
Aboriginal people were seen as inferior and not Australian.
Well, I wonder where these white folks learnt their bushcraft from. Who did they watch to learn all this?
I think it's a bit of both. So I think they're watching and learning from each other. I think as well it's just trial and error as well.
I guess. Yeah, I suppose.
Now, by the mid 1800s, Australia introduced a new government position, Protector of Aborigines. The frontier wars were beginning to look a little embarrassing for the Australian government. Stories of the violence were making its way back to the motherland, where humanitarian groups and churches began criticising their handling of Aboriginal people. Despite this, the settlers were still intent on expanding further into Australia. The answer to this was the Protectors. Their job on paper was to manage the Aboriginal populations to limit the violence that happened when settlers inevitably expanded into their territories. The way that they managed that was to identify and try to move Aboriginal people into reserves, little pockets of land where they could live, effectively an open air prison. Unsurprisingly, none of these protectors were of Aboriginal descent. They were all white Australians. In time, this position became insanely powerful. Protectors would go on to have the final say on things like where Aboriginal people could live, where they could work, where they could travel, even who they could marry. But arguably, the worst thing they had control over was Aboriginal children themselves. They are not the children of the parents, they become the children of the protectors, and the protectors get final say as to what happens to them.
What the fuck?
Yeah, mental, innit?
Why?
Because, right, let's get into it. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, eugenics was the science. Coined by Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, the idea was that if Darwin's theory of evolution was correct, and you could selectively breed animals to produce superior specimens, then why shouldn't that also apply to humans? Now, this idea went crazy with new theories on how race was a hierarchical structure, that some humans were superior to others, while white Europeans were at the top. Aboriginal people were seen as primitive and incapable of fully integrating with white Australia. Tied to this was the dying race theory. So many Aboriginal people had been killed since the arrival of the First Fleet. Many officials believed that Aboriginal people, as a primitive people, were doomed to die out as Australia continued to modernise, as if they were fucking allergic to modernity.
It's almost like they're trying to justify the killings, being like, oh, well, they're going to die out soon.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. They are trying to justify what they are doing at every point. The reality was that these people had died out because they were often straight up murdered, died from diseases, or were driven to starvation as they were pushed further away from lands that they would regularly have used for sustenance. The protectors of Aboriginal people decided that their job was not to protect Aboriginal people, but to essentially manage their decline and eventual extinction. All the things that I mentioned earlier, deciding who they could marry and procreate with, became a governmental decision. Then the protectors took direct control over all Aboriginal children. Every single child born was not a child of the parent, but a child of the protectors, and it was they who would decide what happened to them, who they would marry, where they would go. Oftentimes, they would be given, if they looked white enough that they could pass as being Australian, they would be given to an Australian family.
I suppose the fucked up logic would be if they take all of the children, eventually there'll be a whole generation of people they could deem as Australian, and then the Aboriginal customs way of life they'll be gone. They'll die out with the elders.
Spot on, spot on. It's exactly that, and it's the guy that we're about to introduce here, who genuinely thinks that. In regards to our story, of course, the protector for Western Australia in 1917 was Auber Octavius Neville. He'll go on to be known as A.O. Neville from here on. He's a man who knew fuck all about Aboriginal Australians. He wasn't even born in Australia. He'd moved there in his 20s. He was obsessed with mixed race children. He was firmly of the belief that Aboriginal people would eventually die out, but that was effectively too slow for him. What he wanted to do was have mixed race children integrate into white society who may go on to then marry other white Australians, have white children with them, and thus would dilute the Aboriginal blood further until it was completely gone, which is straight up menacing.
It's essentially genocide without raising a weapon.
Yes, yes.
Is ethnic cleansing, I think, is the words I'm looking for.
Yeah. I think you're right. That obviously that word wouldn't have existed back then, but I think you're right. It's as close to it really that they're trying to get rid of an entire civilization through trying to breed them out. It's disgusting.
Yeah, that's why they decide who you can marry, because presumably you wouldn't put two dark-skinned people with each other because then they'd have a dark-skinned child. They want to make sure they have as white a child as physically possible.
Yeah. So the idea was, and obviously James, you watched the video earlier where it sort of looks a little bit about Moore River settlement later, where Aboriginal people who were very much darker in skin were pretty much kept in these settlements and basically managed sort of their life there, where hopefully, the idea was that they would live and die there. But children, like I say, mixed race children who could pass or, whatnot as they grew, they would be given out to other families and hope that they could then go get jobs and marry people and all that sort of stuff. They were managed in a different way.
But you know what's mental to me? If I think about it, even if this batshit plan succeeded, you've got rid of all the elders of the Aboriginal people, and then you've got this mixed race generation. They would then be targeted because they're mixed race. I think people always need someone to beat with a stick. Do you know what I mean? Like, they'd always be looking for the next enemy.
Who do you mean by the leaders and then the mixed race kids?
So you get the elders that are in this like camp. So as soon as they die, you then have the generation that came after them that are sort of like the mixed race, the ones that could pass for white. And if they're the only ones that then exist, the true white Australians are probably going to look down upon them, are they not?
Oh, no, you're right. And what we'll get on to is that a lot of these mixed race kids, whilst they're allowed to sort of integrate into white Australian society, they're not allowed to integrate as equals. They integrate as house maids and labourers and stuff like that. They're an underclass, but they pass.
Right, that's good then. You get to work in the house, but don't you dare fucking call me by my name.
Yes, yeah. There's a two-tier thing going on here. So it is in this year of 1917 where our person for the story, Molly Craig, is born. She is a mixed-race child born to an Aboriginal mother of the Martu people, whose traditional country stretches across the deserts of Western Australia. Her father was a white Australian who came into contact with her mother at a place called Jigalong, a remote settlement that was specifically founded in 1907 to be a storehouse for materials and rations for those building the rabbit-proof fence. So, what happened was, at some point down in Victoria, like southeast Australia, a guy owned some rabbits, and then for being bored and wanted to hunt rabbits, released a bunch of them, and then rabbits being rabbits, and Australia being as big as it is, they went fucking mental, and no word of a lie, billions of rabbits came from this bunch. And where are they going to go? They're going from east all the way west to the other side of the continent. They're just growing and growing and growing. And actually, Australians can't keep up. They're literally shooting them by the thousands. There are pictures of trucks and wagons and stuff where it's literally wall to wall. All four walls of this wagon is just lined with rabbits. They cannot kill them quick enough. And so what's happening is these billions of rabbits are going over to Western Australia where there is really good fertile farmland. And these guys living in Perth and all that sort of area around there, they're terrified of this happening and their farmland being ruined. So the answer to that was to build a fence. And it was a pretty cool idea. They basically wanted to build a fence from south right up to north and effectively cut the country, split it in half almost. And they effectively did it, although there were some apparently funny stories about where guys are literally building the fence as they can see the rabbit horde sort of coming toward them, and they're trying to build it quicker. And then like rabbits are sort of starting to hop over the fence and they're grabbing them by the feet and launching them back over the fence, being like, no, get out, get fucked, mate, and then throwing them back. And eventually they end up building like more fences sort of to cut off different areas because they start breaking through. But regardless, this one particular fence that we're going to be referring to, the rabbit proof fence, this does go from south all the way up north.
That's really interesting. I bet they ate a lot of rabbit.
Oh, yeah, probably. They probably got sick of it. Now, Molly's father was a fence inspector, okay? So these people would literally patrol up and down the fence either by car, bicycle, or camel-drawn wagons, which is cool. Now, it seems that the father was somewhat invested in Molly's life. I couldn't find out too much about him. Many frontier records, of course, are lost to the ages or were poorly kept at the time. That and the fact that many Aboriginal histories are passed down orally. Because of this, it is hard to pinpoint what the relationship was like. But we do know that she knew who he was and she carried his surname, Craig. In my head canon, since her father is a fence inspector and Jigalong is a storehouse settlement, not really a permanent home at the time, I think it's likely that her father met her mother on the job, but since his job was to keep patrolling up and down the fence, he was like a passing ship to them. And we know that he would often bring the girls clothes, gifts, supplies for both Molly and her mother. But there seems to be no real record of him being around as she grew up. So I think it's likely that he ended up moving on somewhere else. Now, what we do know is that Molly was well liked in her community despite being mixed race. It's said that some of the kids were initially a little wary of her, but, you know, kids are kids. They'll pick out the most obvious difference between them and then be best friends with you in 2 minutes. Like, that's just what they're like. She had a cousin called Gracie, who was a couple of years younger, and they were really close. She then got a sister called Daisy. So her mum would go on to have another partner, and then Daisy came around. So she's a stepsister. But they're a proper little family unit. And the community played a huge role. You know that whole saying, like, it takes a village to raise a child? There's a fantastic video that I watched where Aboriginal people were sort of answering sort of, you know, common questions that people say. And so I learnt that auntie, uncle are used quite common, like, what's the word? Quite loosely to refer to like older people from like, they might not be actually related to you, but you call them auntie.
Other cultures do that as well, yeah.
Yeah. And one woman was sat saying like, you know, why they do that. And she was like, because, like, no disrespect to like your parents, but like you're daft if you think your parent can teach you everything in life. That's not true. Like, there are things that your parent won't know, but that person does, and they'll teach you things, and then they become your family by doing so. And so of course their auntie, of course their uncle, because they're teaching you and they're helping you grow as a human as well. So it's like it's a community thing. It's quite nice.
It makes me realise how sort of cold we are, especially in the UK. With like, we're not a community-led country. I don't think we're very much a here's my border, you fuck off, don't even look at my child.
It's slightly different. It's more insular, isn't it? The family unit is insular rather than it being sort of open and everyone can become family.
Oh yeah, no one tells each other how they feel. I always think in Britain people seem to really like keep calm and carry on. They say that's what makes us British, keep calm and carry on. I think it's our detriment. I think that's what really fucks us up.
Oh yeah, I think you might be right. Yeah.
We have mental health issues galore, and it's because no one talks to each other, which is such a shame. but it is what it is.
Now, Molly seems to have gotten on fine in Jigalong, but that was maybe the problem. Remember the protector of Aborigines, A.O. Neville, known as Neville the Devil for his views and oppression of Aboriginal peoples. He was keen on having mixed race children integrate into white Australian society to breed out their Aboriginal blood and culture. And to do this, places like Moore River Native Settlement were built in 1918. Over a century of conflict and expansion had left many Aboriginal peoples displaced, and since the government now had Aboriginal protectors, their job was to try and manage the consequences of this. Settlements were created all over the country with the goal of elevating the Aboriginal residents by educating them and giving them the skills for life in work, such as farming and basic trade work. On paper, it sounds okay, I guess, but the reality was not that. While they were educated, it was to a very minimal standard, and the skills they were taught were very specific. For boys and men, it was labouring work, and for girls, it was typical domestic chores, and this was for a reason. They weren't doing this to better the Aboriginal people and make them equals within a white society, but to create a whole subclass of servants and labourers.
I feel like this story has a lot of parallels with America in terms of sort of how the slave trade went down. You teach the people what they need to be taught, but it's a lot easier to subjugate a less educated group of people. So you don't teach them too much. You teach them enough to serve you, but no more.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, listen, it's probably wrong of us to try and equate in some ways. Of course, there will be some things that we can go, oh, it reminds us of this, that, and the other. And to sort of to bring it back home, I think it reminds of our sort of educational system in that, there's that old phrase, if you were to judge a fish's intelligence by its ability to climb a tree, you would say it was stupid, right? Our educational system has been, since the Victorian era, very, very simple and basic, i.e. can you count to 10, do times tables and this sort of the other, because eventually the idea was that you didn't want to educate them because you wanted them to become brilliant. You wanted to educate them so they'd go into a factory and just work.
Yeah.
So the education was relatively simple, and it's obviously come a long way, but still a lot more to do. Conditions at these settlements were poor. Moore River Native Settlement, situated 80 miles away from northeast of Perth, Western Australia, was no different. Aboriginal people were brought in from all over the state, which caused significant overcrowding, with up to 500 people being kept there. It got so bad that they began building makeshift shelters using logs and sticks to protect themselves from the elements. People were split by the sexes. The children were then also separated from their parents. Aboriginal languages were not to be spoken at the site, and physical abuse was dished out to those who disobeyed this rule. Sanitation was an issue at the site. This was due to the overcrowding and the poor facilities. It meant that disease was rife and many got sick. We know that between 1918 and 1952, 346 deaths were recorded at the site, with most of these being children under 5. For many people staying at Moore River Settlement, it was described as hell on earth. Paul Hasluck, though he would go on to become Governor General of Australia later in his life, was a young journalist when he visited Moore River in the 1930s. He said of it,
I visited the Moore River settlement several times. The setting was a poor one with no advantage for anyone except isolation. The facilities were limited and some of them were makeshift. The staff were inadequate both in numbers and qualification. The inmates disliked the place. It held no promise of a future for any of them, and they had little or no satisfaction in the present. It was a dump.
and that's a guy in the 1930s saying that.
Yeah, standards were lower back then, weren't they? You've described to me a concentration camp is how I'm imagining it.
Yeah, basically, effectively an open air prison as close to it. And obviously, you watched the video. I sent you some homework to sort of, and they do discuss it in that. And yeah, it's crap. You see
corrugated
pictures.
iron in Australia. That you're cooking people.
So we know that this place is pretty terrible for Aboriginal people, but then the state's ideas shifted, and then this is when we get the dying race theory, which is when we see A.O. Neville pivot his thinking to include mixed race children. So back in Jigalong, Molly is living a pretty normal life, but that doesn't mean eyes aren't on her. The superintendent of the Jigalong station evidently shares A.O. Neville's settlement. The superintendent of the Jigalong station evidently shares AO Neville's sentiment about mixed race children and lets the authorities know that there are mixed race children at Jigalong being brought up by Aboriginal people. Triggered, the state sends their people to take Molly, her sister Daisy, and cousin Gracie by force. Nobody gets a say in the matter. Remember, the children are effectively the children of AO Neville, and he can dictate what is done with them. Even having a white parent is not going to save you because the child is of mixed race. Therefore, they will take the child based on that.
What's the cut-off? If that mixed race child then had another child with a white Australian, air quotes, is that child then AO Neville's, or is that one fine? Like, where's the cut-off?
They actually have, like, you've got, I don't like using the term, but they had I won't use the term, but there's someone who is a full Aboriginal person, and then there's one Australian, one Aboriginal, and it's the half, and then someone who is then one under that is sort of a quarter Aborigine. That's still classed as an Aboriginal person still at that point. So I think like one more after that would probably be okay.
That's mad. You're literally you need generations to sort of clear this out. For
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's not too far off how the Nazis sort of had their own thing of what was deemed as Jewish.
Yeah.
Didn't think the Nazis would appear in this one, eh?
Oh, the Nazis appear everywhere. I feel like the same blueprint happens every time we talk about a story of one group of persons trying to eradicate another one. They all seem to follow a very similar blueprint.
Yes, they do.
And I guess it's because effectively the blueprint, it works.
Yeah, effectively, yeah, and we never learn again. Now, it's a harrowing image seeing grown men grab 3 young girls who have done nothing wrong except for exist and throw them in a truck where they'll be taken to a camp and likely never see their families again. Now, the journey down was filled with lies. The girls were told that the place that they would go would give them an education and a chance at a new life. But when they finally arrived, after almost 2 weeks of travel consisting of cars, trains, and a coastal steamer ship, they were met with the reality of the camp. They arrived late at night, so the place was quiet. They were issued a dorm room and taken by a staffer. At the door, they noticed that it was padlocked, and there were people inside of this dorm. They're padlocked in overnight. It's stifling. The room is filled to the brim with people sharing beds. The only toilet was a bucket in the corner of the dorm, and I can only imagine that first night for them was absolutely terrifying. Very quickly, the girls realised how bad this place was. They were unable to speak their native language, nor were they allowed to perform any of their cultural practices. They were learning how to cook and sew, all things they would need to be able to one day work in the home of a white Australian as help. Molly had the type of confidence you would expect to find of a 14-year-old. There was no way she or her family were ever going to be staying here. After a few weeks at Moore River Native Settlement, they needed to escape. Wandering around the camp looking for a way out, they were aware of children with their heads shaved. These kids had recently been in the boob, a shabby hut made out of corrugated iron where people were locked in as punishment for many rule breaks, especially trying to escape. But a lot of these rule breaks would be speaking your own fucking language. They'd put you in this. And if the girls were going to go, they can't get caught because they don't want to be put in the boob.
No, that sounds horrific.
Now, the main question wasn't necessarily how they were going to get out, but how they were going to navigate their way home. But for Molly, that was actually an easy one. She's quite keen on her bushcraft and was well aware of the land that she grew up on. Again, this is, you know, that community thing. Like lots of people in her local community, she'd have learned how to do bushcraft. She'd have learned sort of how to navigate and travel and all this sort of stuff. And she's only 14, and lots of people would have taught her lots of things. She knew that the rabbit-proof fence, which ran by her hometown of Jigalong, stretched for hundreds of miles south. So in theory, all they needed to do was walk east out of the camp and eventually they'd hit the fence. Once they'd done that, they simply needed to follow it north and they'd eventually find home. So on a cloudy morning before their 3-hour education classes began, the girls made a run for it. The girls were barefoot and had very little with them regarding supplies, just whatever they could grab before leaving. And if I could just take a moment away from the story here to sort of recognize my Eurocentric brain, when I saw that the girls were barefoot and they didn't take much with them regarding sort of rations, I seriously questioned why. Part of me wondered if it was the impatience of a teenager just wanting to get home. Another part thought that it was an oversight by Molly and her siblings, and that this journey that they embark on would just come down to luck. But damn, was I wrong. I've had to acknowledge my lack of knowledge, basically, and how, as a European, my brain is wired in a way that is very different to Molly's, and probably Aboriginal people as a whole. While I do have some experiences with camping out in the wilds, I had equipment. I had compasses, maps, rations, tents, boots. Hardly roughing it out, right? But Molly and her siblings are barefoot, not because they forgot to take shoes with them, but because they don't really need them. They likely wouldn't have been common items of clothing back at home, preferring more so to be connected with the ground that they're walking on. They'd also have feet that were more accustomed to the harsh desert terrain. My soft European feet almost certainly couldn't do it. I cry when the sand is a bit too hot on holiday. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I think this is the thing. Like, she knows that she has everything she needs to survive the journey and will be able to live off the land. If me and you did the same journey, we wouldn't make it.
Yes, exactly. Even down to their lack of a need to take rations with them, right? Again, this is not an oversight. They likely knew how helpful it would be to take some food with them, right? They're not stupid, but this would have required stockpiling food in a place that actually had very little as it was. Plus, it's something that they have to carry with them, which might have slowed them down. What they were confident on was their bushcraft. Okay, Molly and her siblings had learned how to find food in the desert from their family members over the years. They were confident that they could do it themselves. Honestly, put a 12-year-old in the middle of centre parks today and they'd still starve.
Yeah, especially like British kids. They're fucking useless.
They really are. Now, for the girls having just left the settlement, it must have been an anxiety inducing day. They might have been miles away by now, but they knew that their disappearance would be noticed at any moment and people would come after them. And really, right, the camp used their own Aboriginal residents' knowledge against them. People who were skilled trackers would then often be deployed to go and locate those that had escaped. I just think that's awful that they'd send people to do that.
Again, we bring it at the Nazis. They used to use Jewish people to sort of round up with the Jewish people. I guess, did these people that were trackers get sort of a bit of preferential treatment?
You would imagine so, yeah.
It's incredible, isn't it, what a little bit of incentive can do to someone who's desperate.
Now, after a long day of walking, the girls needed to find somewhere to sleep, but the weather was overcast and it looked like rain. So instead of trying to build a temporary shelter, Molly had a clever idea. They found a rabbit burrow large enough for them to squeeze in and cuddle for warmth overnight. Of course, there was a rabbit burrow. There's fucking billions of them. There was no shortage of burrows, of course, so any trackers that would have to search, they'd have to go through a bunch of them, like whack-a-mole, like trying to find these girls within a burrow. Now, as night turned to day, the girls were back on their feet and made some serious progress. On average, they were covering close to 20 miles a day.
Oh, getting those steps in.
Getting them steps in. And also, again, like Australia's so big, you can do 20 miles a day and still not really get anywhere. Now, along the way, they'd seen several farmsteads, which they were initially reluctant to go near for fear that they'd be reported to the authorities. And while they were confident in their bushcraft, they were also far enough away that they could probably afford to carry some food if they could find it. So, having plucked up enough courage to visit a few places, they were actually able to scrounge together some rations for the long journey, which is quite nice. You know, knock at a door and someone was actually like, yeah, do you know what? All right, kid, here's some stuff. And I looked into this. I was a bit curious because a lot of these farmsteads would be white Australians. So I was like, why would they help, Aboriginal children standing at the door randomly? And it's kind of like one of those, if you're living out in sort of the arsehole of nowhere, you kind of get how rough it can be out there. So when someone knocks on your door and is like, can I get a bit of help? You're like, okay, maybe try it.
Well, what goes around comes around. You'd hope that if you were in the same situation one day and you knocked on someone's door, they'd sort you out.
Now, at one point in their journey, they had to climb up a tree to hide in the branches because they saw an airplane flying low nearby. Their instinct to hide was correct because this plane was the state, desperately looking for the girls. They didn't know it yet, but they'd caused quite a stir back at the settlement. A week after their escape, they were in the papers, and A.O. Neville was being pressed for allowing 3 young girls to wander off the settlement. He actually tries to play it down in the newspaper article. It says something like how he's like, oh, they were just a bit sort of like nervous about the environment and they didn't like it, so they ran away and we're trying to get them back because it's dangerous for them. Like as if it was like, they shouldn't. They didn't plan to run away. It was just they got a bit spooked. And it's like,
they fled.
bro, they fled for a fucking reason.
They're fleeing you.
Now, by this time, the girls were struggling a bit. Okay, their feet had become more accustomed to walking barefoot, but they're not as tough as old boots, right? And they were covered in cuts and bruises, as I'm sure you can imagine. And they were starting to get a little infected, which means walking was starting to become a bit painful. So Daisy and Gracie, who are both in quite a lot of discomfort, these are the 2 younger ones. Molly ends up doing the big sister thing, and she actually carries them in sort of intervals, piggybacks them along the way, which is just like, again, it's one of those big sister things at family. You would just do it, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Then they saw it. The rabbit-proof fence. Molly's gamble paid off. After travelling for over a week, they'd reached the landmark that would quite literally guide them home. They'd travelled for roughly 100 miles barefoot to find the fence. This was likely the hardest part of the journey psychologically. Having a vague idea of the direction of travel and just hoping it would pay off while being chased the entire time, like anxiety inducing. But this second leg of the journey would in theory be easier. All they had to do was follow the rabbit-proof fence north and they'd stumble across Jigalong. What they didn't know was how far they actually had to go, because home from here was still roughly 900 miles away.
I'm trying to put that into perspective. If I travelled from here 900 miles, I must be pushing Austria, maybe?
I looked this up. So it's actually longer than the British Isles, so you would end up swimming. So they've walked the entire length of the UK and more so. But if you was to say start in Lisbon in Portugal, you could probably make it to Paris.
That's mad. And that's 900 miles.
Roughly, yeah.
That's because I think about my journey from here to back home in Birmingham, and I think that's like 150.
Yeah, 100.
I want to say 100.
Yeah, 100 something.
And I think that's long. I hate that journey. That's 900 miles, barefoot, infected, hungry, thirsty, sun beating down. Whew.
Yeah, it's very impressive for a 14, 11-year-old and an 8-year-old.
Yeah, and they're just... So how far have they gone this... So the distance from the camp to the fence was how much?
Roughly 100 miles.
100, and now they've got to do another 9... But they don't know they've got to do 900.
No, they don't. They have no idea how
walk.
far away it is. They're just walking. So, like, even the mentality to stay mentally strong when you don't know when it's going to end. Like, that's the hard part. Like, when I have my moments of, like, getting jumped straight back in to do my 5K runs and stuff like that. Like, I know the route now, so I know when I'm halfway. I know when I can push a little bit hard and all that sort of stuff. But if you're just walking in an endless direction and you don't know when you're going to stop, you're like, well, why would I continue? What's the point? So, walking along the fence, they came across a few farms and stations where people, were keeping the fence maintained, like their home in Jigalong. They even met with an Aboriginal man who was kind enough to give them some matches to make a fire. He was concerned about their cuts and bruises, though, right? The girls clearly needed some medical attention. After they'd moved on, he actually reported them more for their own safety than for any other reason, of course. In fact, he wasn't the only one. So all these other farmsteads that they'd been to who gave them a little bit of food, they knew who these girls were. They understood what was going on. And because of sort of, the fact that they knew that what they were doing is quite dangerous, they all reported the girls as they went, right? We all love a good walk, a nice trek. I say that James can get a bit grumpy on a long walk.
I want to jump in here. I love long walks. I genuinely love a long walk. What I don't like is being told, oh, we'll only do a quick filming day. It'll be really quick. And then effectively doing the fucking London Marathon. Ryan likes to not tell me how far we've actually got to go. He's like, yeah, we'll do this quick. We'll do this quick. We'll do this quick. And then it turns into a whole fucking thing. I'm grumpy about it now.
But what they're doing isn't easy at all, okay, right? So all 3 of them are tired, they're in pain, but they can't exactly turn back, right? They need to keep going, or do they? See, when they reached Mount Russell Station, which had a railway, they spotted more people. One of these people spoke with the girls, and as luck would have it, they actually knew Cousin Gracie's mum. Not just that, this person knew that her mum had moved from Jigalong. There was no point carrying on to Jigalong. You gotta go somewhere else. I know where your mum lives. Follow me, I'll take you to your mum. Now, Molly, not having it. She's like, no, I'm big sister. You're not going. That's not happening. She didn't trust this person, but Gracie was so adamant, they almost couldn't fight her. Like Gracie went. And I hear it, she's 11, that she's physically and emotionally tired. She wants her mum, and this person is offering her that. So Gracie accepted the stranger's offer, and despite Molly and Daisy's protests, she went off. Gracie would not find her mother with this person. She would instead be recaptured and sent back to the settlement. What's worse is the fact that they were so close to home at this point. After walking further, they came across station 594. It's a cattle station. Naturally wary after what had just happened with Gracie, they approached with care, but they were in luck. Their auntie lived at the station. After a month of walking barefoot across the Australian outback, being chased almost the entire way, having to live on bush food when they could and use rations from kind strangers, with their legs and feet all cut up and being one down, they had found a familial face who greeted them with open arms and a hot meal. The sleep that they had that night must have been deep.
Yeah, it must have been such a relief after all of that trauma to see someone you know. I bet tears were shed.
Yeah, almost certainly. Now, they might be safe now, but they weren't home just yet. Molly's aunt had sorted for the girls to join the maintenance workers the next day on their journey out along the fence to Jigalong. They were being escorted home, and the best part was the lads letting the girls ride along on the camels. The couple days' journey from there to Jigalong was full of excitement, right? They were traveling with their cousin, who was also at the station, and his boss. And as they got close to Jigalong Creek, their uncle had actually met them part way, and he decided, he was like, I'm going to ride ahead to town. I'm going to let your mum know, and she's going to meet you at the gate. And this is the nice touch, because this is exactly what happens, right? As they walk into Jigalong, their mum is waiting for them.
I bet that was a really nice reunion.
Yeah, it's a nice sort of image, isn't it? There was no time to hang around though. After a night of celebration, the family were on the move. They collected their possessions and they left Jigalong the very next day, moving further into the desert where they would effectively disappear. They weren't taking any chances. Jigalong is on a map. The girls could be tracked back there, and white Australians might actually have a bit more trouble trying to navigate the desert to find them. And I think that's a smart move. They're like, listen, we know our country. We're just going to move out.
Especially in uncharted territory for the white Australians. Like, is a needle in a haystack at that point.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, from there, I don't know much more. I can't tell you where they lived or what life was like. They really do disappear for quite a period of time. Gracie, who had left the girls to find her mum, she did end up back at Moore River Native Settlement. She had the full experience and would go on to find work as domestic help for a nearby farm. She would go on to marry and have 6 children. So far as I could find it, she never went back to her home in Jigalong. She would pass away in 1983, aged 63. Now, we find Molly and Daisy again a little bit older. Daisy would go on to learn domestic skills and find work as domestic help. She too would go on to marry and have 4 children. She actually found Jesus and lived and worked at Karalundi Mission, which is an institution created by Seventh-day Adventists. Her kids schooled there, getting a Christian education. And later in life, she actually moved back to Jigalong to be closer with her family, living next door to her sister. She would pass away in 2018, which would have made her about 95.
2018? That's crazy, because you describe this world of escaping effectively a concentration camp and you think, well, that's ages away. Well, that couldn't have happened in modern times. And it was not that long ago.
No. Now, Molly's story isn't as easy to wrap up, sadly. That isn't to suggest that both Gracie and Daisy's lives were easy, of course, but Molly is, the name of our episode, so that's who we're going to focus on. They'd have had their difficulties, of course, like everyone else, but, life really found a way to trip up Molly. She too would eventually come out from the desert and then go on to learn domesticated skills and become house help. She too would go on to marry. She actually had two daughters, Doris and Annabelle. In 1940, World War II's kicked off. When Molly is 23, she's taken to hospital in Perth with appendicitis, which, is pretty standard treatment, even for the time. They understood appendicitis, they could probably whip that out. But while she's in hospital, a warrant for her arrest is issued. It seems that somebody is holding a grudge. Molly was arrested and, along with her daughters, was sent back to Moore River Settlement. By this time, the place was even more run down than when she was there 9 years previous, because remember, there's a war going on. They ain't giving no rations or spares to Aboriginal peoples. That's just not happening.
Doesn't Australia as well, not at this point, obviously, but when the theatre of war becomes sort of Asia, Japan, Americans are stationed in Australia for a time, aren't they?
Yeah. Americans will be stationed in Australia. They tend to go I believe they tend to go down Sydney and Melbourne area because it's right down at the bottom of the continent, effectively. So they felt relatively safe down that end. Quite a lot of children born are children born of US servicemen who spent time there. Now, while at Moore River Native Settlement, Molly got a letter from her family informing her that there had been a death in the family. She was desperate to get back home and, in fact, asked for permission to leave but was denied, almost as if they were punishing her. They're like, you can get fucked if you think you're leaving. Her husband and family, though, were back at home. She needed to get back to them. After some thought, she decided she was going to walk the rabbit-proof fence again. She's 23 now.
Well, I suppose I'm older. I've done it before. But then you've got kids with you. Well, she had kids with her last time, but these are younger, aren't they?
Yeah, 4 and 18 months.
That's a different kettle of fish.
Exactly. This is the thing. She's done it once. She could definitely do it again, but she's got 2 babies with her, man. Doris was 4. She's running around. She's active. But Annabelle, she's only 18 months old. She still needs her mother. Molly didn't think she could do the journey with both of them. So she made the painful decision of leaving Doris at Moore River. Not that brutal. She had a relative at the settlement and she left Doris with her. Perhaps she thought that if she could get back home, she could then try and get Doris back too. But in the settlement, she's got absolutely no power at all. At least if she left, she might have more leverage. She might be able to try something. And if all else fails, she's at least with a relative. So Molly then set off on the 1,000-mile journey back home with her 18-month-old strapped to her, and she made it.
Again?
Yeah, she made it again. She was reunited with her husband. She would try to get Doris back home, but tragedy would strike again. When Annabelle was 3, the authorities took her from Molly and put her in a children's home. This woman just cannot get a break. In fact, Annabelle would go on to be told that she was an orphan and she never saw Molly again.
Fuck.
It's awful, isn't it? It's horrific.
She embarrassed the powers that be and they wanted to punish her.
Yeah. And these are obviously you watched the video earlier. The stolen generation. These are Aboriginal kids who are taken away from their families, given to white Australian families, brought up almost knowing none the wiser. Some of them. So yeah, a lot of people are of Aboriginal descent, and you probably couldn't even tell in Australia. You have to be very mindful of that. There was one guy I was watching a video, and one guy was like, "Well, like coffee, man. Some have a bit more milk in it than others, but still coffee."
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, just different shades of it. And they're like, "Yeah, I like that. It was cool." It was a young guy, so he was really blasé about it. Doris would eventually be reunited with Molly, but not for another 20 years. They reconnected and Doris completely understood her mother's decision. She was inspired by her mother's bravery and actually wrote down her story, having it published as a book called Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence. Molly would pass away in 2004, aged 87. She spent her final years living next door to her sister Daisy.
Nice. That's good.
Yeah, it's good. I like that. Now, Moore River Native settlement would go on till the 50s when it was transferred over to a Methodist church to run and was finally closed properly in 1974 and is pretty much abandoned today. I think it's still maintained a certain way, but it's not used in any other way. Doris's book telling her mother's story would go on to be made into a film, which was released in 2002 called Rabbit Proof Fence, starring Evelyn Sampi, David Gulpilil, and Kenneth Branagh. The film was positively received from a critic's perspective, but in Australia overall, it was met with a bit of controversy. I think people would prefer not to address their dark past. I think that really was the problem with it. Some historians straight up called into question the accuracy of the film as a way of sort of diminishing it. Look, of course, it's a film, right? There will be some creative license here and there, right? But it's never stopped Ridley Scott, right? People don't cry about it that much. The sad reality is that Australia still has a complicated relationship with its Aboriginal population. Despite making up less than 5% of the population, Aboriginal Australians rank among the worst in the country for health, incarceration, and poverty. They have a significantly lower life expectancy at 71 for males and 75 for females, compared to their non Aboriginal countrymen at 80 for males and 83 for females. That's a huge difference in life expectancy. I mean, in terms of our story, of course, Aboriginal people have higher rates of diabetes, kidney disease, heart disease, smoking-related illnesses, and suicide, with a rate 3 times higher than their non-Aboriginal peoples.
Well, that goes hand in hand with poverty, doesn't it? And incarceration and bad health.
Yes, and this is really sort of the crux of it, and where we'll sort of go on a little bit further on here. But yes, to your point, yeah, a lot of it is down to poverty and the fact that opportunities are less in certain areas for certain peoples. And I'm sorry, like it's not a unique thing for Aboriginal people. If you look at other societies, you see the poorest in your society. What is the correlation? It's the fact that it's poverty. They have less things available to them, whereas people that have more wealth and more opportunities, they don't have these problems.
I heard this analogy to put into perspective sort of black communities in America, but I think it works here. Imagine the world as a monopoly board and the white communities are starting. Every time they pass go, they get 200 and they're starting with properties all around the board. Whereas Aboriginal people, they're getting like 50 every time they pass go and they're not starting with properties. They're having to pay rent on the properties they're landing in. Like, how the fuck are they ever going to catch up in that game? It's never going to happen.
Yes, and to sort of reference something we spoke about in our Unit 731 series, when we spoke about the fact that Japan went from samurais and lords to an empire effectively within 50 years, right? And I said about how humans ain't supposed to evolve that quick, right? We evolve naturally. A culture and the way we live has to sort of grow naturally, but we are effectively still cavemen, but we have cars and light bulbs and microphones to do podcasts with now. You have an Aboriginal culture of people, an Aboriginal people who, you know, effectively within 300 years have had to basically have their entire fucking culture like strewn across history to bring them to sort of more the present time, or sort of to bring them up to speed with a European type of living. And so, you know, are we shocked that, you know, for a lot of them, there is a culture shock where it's like, you know, our cultural things are this, or this, and you're expecting us to not be able to do this or this, and we have to fit in with that, but that doesn't quite align with sort of how we've done this for generations. Like there's almost like a learning still ongoing that they've not quite been able to sort of understand each other or where they're at. There's so much growing still to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
I could go on and throw out a million stats that I've found from the Australian government sites about, you know, the plight of Aboriginal people. But if there's one thing I have taken away from it all, is that there seems to be a difficulty when it comes down to funding in certain areas. Many Aboriginal people do live in cities and towns and integrate completely fine, but there are many who prefer to live in remote areas to be closer to their ancestral country, and they struggle with funding. Okay, so there are debates on whether these remote communities should be funded by the state. These are places that are for, for only a few people are really of any significance. They're not economic regions, so, you know, money that's going to get put in is certainly not going to be made back out at any sort of profit at all. So many people who don't understand sort of the need for this think it's a waste of money. So there's lots of debates about, do we continue to treat, Aboriginal spiritual homes as somewhere that, we should fund? Why should necessarily, to use their argument, why should someone in, I don't know, the Gold Coast fund an Aboriginal spiritual home in Western Australia? Like, why would it matter to them in terms of how the funding may work? That's probably not really a good example, but you see the thought process. Really, they're like, I don't get it. So there are lots of charities who help these communities, which is awesome. People who help with medical needs, educational needs, etc. Look, at the end of the day, I'm not here to preach to Australia on how they ought to behave with their sort of Aboriginal cousins. I'm not Australian. I'm not an expert in this topic, of course. I have learned loads while researching this episode, and I have hardly scratched the surface, okay? But in 2008, Australian government, led by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, apologised on behalf of Australia to all Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islander people for their involvement in forced removal of children from their families. It was a long overdue acknowledgement. While it doesn't change what happened, nor does it make things immediately better by doing it, it is at least a move in the right direction. And I really do hope that things get better for all Australians.
I think that's a nice way of putting it. I think I watched the apology, and like part of you, when you see an apology, you go, yeah, now what? Like, it's all well and good saying that, but now what? But then I guess you have to start somewhere. And acknowledging something happened is starting somewhere. Burying your head in the sand is the opposite of what you should do. I think the now what is you have to ensure that, what is it, the 5% of the population that are Aboriginals are getting the equal opportunities. They're not living in poverty. Their life expectancy goes up. They're getting the medical treatment. They're getting the mental health care. Bring them on par with you, and then you can see a fully integrated society.
Yeah, and again, like I say, like we as two English blokes, we're not here to preach to Australia or Australians on how they ought to sort of behave or sort of handle this situation. That's not what we're here to do, and that's not what we're doing. And like I mentioned just then, many Aboriginal peoples absolutely fine. Like, relatively speaking, they're able to, they integrate into society absolutely fine. There's no problem there. A lot of it is that there's a minority of Aboriginal people who prefer to live sort of a more sort of life that is closer to country, closer to their ancestors and homes and things like that. And they're the people that sort of suffer with struggle with funding and other medical facilities and things such as that. And they're the people that sort of people tend to focus on and then assume that everyone's like that. And that's, of course, not the case. Like, I have seen some horrific, genuinely, as an English person with not much skin in the game, even I found it like uncomfortable, where like I've seen videos like on TikTok where people are mocking and having a go at some Aboriginal country places, like where they're teaching young kids to like not sleep in the road. And like, they're mocking them for this, right? And listen, again, for white English people, it may sound strange, but if you live out in the country where, there's not many cars, not many things around, and you're sort of just out and about in your own country, in your own sort of community or whatever, and you just fancy taking a nap somewhere, in like, maybe, you just be like, I want to take a nap here. And people are like, just be careful, maybe beware, maybe a road or whatever, just, because it might not be clearly marked out. It might not be clearly marked out. It's not going to be tarmacked. It's going to be a dirt road or something like that. But racists are taking that and being like, oh, look at these people. They have to teach kids not to sleep on roads because they're so blah, 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 blah.
But equally then put that racist person in the bush.
Yeah.
Look at this idiot. He can't survive, can't feed himself.
Yeah, exactly.
It goes back to what we said at the top of the episode. You always judge people based on your circumstances, which is why I learned recently that I judged certain Americans on my circumstances, and that's wrong of me. Everyone's different. Everyone lives a different life, and that's okay. And I don't think it's wrong to do that instinctively. I think that's just sort of the world you've been born in. But what you can do, hopefully, is what I'm trying to do, is acknowledge that it happens, acknowledge that maybe I shouldn't think like that, and then try and build yourself from there. I don't think anyone's perfect. We all have moments of watching a video of someone and being like, oh, fucking idiot. Like, if I saw a video of someone sleeping in the middle of the road, my initial reaction will be, what are you doing? Like, that's a road. But that's why you take a little bit longer, I guess, to sort of understand the context around why that might be happening, instead of taking it at face value of this fucking idiot in the middle of a road.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point. There's always context for as to why something is
Yeah. However, that's been said, there probably are some fucking idiots, white English idiots, that will sleep in the middle of the road, despite knowing what a road is. And those people are idiots.
Yeah, there are loads of stories about like people that fall asleep and just like they get drunk and then fall asleep, pass out on a railway, and then lose their legs.
Idiots. Morons. That's the difference. There's a difference between morons and people that have come from a different way of life.
Yes. Yeah. But yeah, fascinating story. And actually, I didn't realize we'd get so much out of this. Thank you so much for joining us on this one. Thank you very much to Nath from Down Under for recommending this story. It's been fascinating for me personally to look into this and understand a little bit more. I really hope that I've done it a wee bit of justice. Please, if we have got anything wrong, please do let me know. I want to learn. I really want to learn more. So if there's anything we've missed or maybe we've got something slightly wrong, please don't ever go at us. Just be like, with respect, Ryan, do this better next time. You did this, you did that. It could be a bit better. Let us know. Yeah, we can only get better from there. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to this mammoth episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next one.
Take it easy.